Was it weird that in this episode we're going to be talking about in 1 second that they didn't once try the sourdough? As you know, this is Measure of an Episode, where it is our continuing mission to explore what makes a genuine Star Trek episode a genuine episode, and not just like Back to the Future 1, where it's just not sci-fi, right? I don't know where I'm going with this. My name is Paul.
And I'm Jonathan, and I kind of agree and I kind of disagree, but we're going to talk about it.
About the sourdough thing?
Yeah. Okay, well, just there actually is a story there. We do this with 3 criteria. 1, is there science fiction written within the plot? 2, is that sci-fi unique? And 3, is there a moral or ethical dilemma that a character has to face? I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Paul. And we might actually, not only are we determining whether or not these episodes are proper or genuine Star Trek, but also maybe we'll have some suggestions on how to make them a little bit better. If they need to be better. Sometimes they're perfect episodes, but sometimes they're not. And so we're going to make them just a little, maybe a little bit better. A little bit.
This one, I feel like the story was really good, but man, Samuel Clemens,
Yeah, he's the weak link in this. So
Absolutely.
I should say that I was totally wrong about this episode.
Okay.
Because I said in our last episode that this might be, as I said in the opening, that just kind of like Back to the Future 1, where not really science fiction. It's just like they use science fiction to get him to the past, and then the whole movie takes place, and then they use science fiction to get him back to the future. Mm-hmm. Or forward to the past. And that was not the case with this. I was pleasantly surprised that this was chock full of lots of fun science fiction-y, Star Trekian stuff. I was elated to watch this episode.
Yes. And so one of the things that has begun to bother me about time travel episodes, especially ones that go to the past, and I don't know if it's kind of a requirement from the production studios or if because it was done the first couple times, everybody feels like they have to do it, but they have to have some kind of famous celebrity at that time before they were famous and have it just be a quick surprise to the audience when we learn about it. Quantum Leap did it all the time.
Yeah, it gets annoying, and it doesn't bring anything to it brings nothing when they do. You're talking about Jack London, right?
Yeah, talking about Jack London.
It brings nothing to the story, the fact that he's Jack London.
Right. And they did it in Forrest Gump with Elvis learning his dance moves from Forrest.
That was sort of the theme of that movie. Was that
right? Was that Forrest Gump provided the signature thing for all these people? Yeah,
but that doesn't excuse it. It just was that thing where it's like, oh, he made the smiley face thing too. Isn't that funny that you're now getting the inception that wasn't the inception of the smiley face? It's like you're just saying, oh, he invented that. Well, now that gets us nowhere narratively. Nowhere.
Right. But I mean, so let's go deep down the Forrest Gump. But he called out Watergate.
It's like the early 1990s version of Ready Player One, where it's just sort of a regular story, but wrapped in a bunch of references to an era, and it does nothing for it. It's like, oh, there's the Millennium Falcon, awesome, right? It's like, well, yeah, I know what the Millennium Falcon. I recognize that. Right. Now where are we?
Fun little jokes, eye candy. It's completely irrelevant to the plot. I gotcha. Yeah. Right. Anyway, so that's what Jack London was in this episode.
He was, right? And it did, he could have left, and I would have liked it better if they didn't say, hey, I'm Jack London, all right? The nice little bow on it. He never shows up ever again, by the way.
After that moment. Yep.
And it would have been better if he was credited as Jack London, but they never said his name in the episode.
Yes.
That would have been better.
Yeah. And production studios, writers, do that from now on. Give us the 2+2 and let us figure out the 4.
And I don't know. I don't know if we would have necessarily. They painted Jack London in this episode as a sort of opportunistic, money-hungry person, which I don't think Jack London was.
Well, that, and also he was a sci-fi writer, and so Jack it's really London?
Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's kind of the pioneer of the sci-fi genre. Yeah, he earned his money through writing, and he was also an innovator in the genre that would later become known as science fiction.
Did he invent a hoverboard?
I mean, he wrote White Fang and the Call of the Wild, which is interesting.
I had no idea. I'm glad we're talking a lot about this character, though.
I know. The one that disappears, yeah.
But so they don't even really make it, I guess Data does, but the episode doesn't really start focusing on San Francisco until part 2. So
Right.
I guess we should read the part 2, or we should read the blurbs at this point, now that we're half an hour into the episode. The Next Generation, Season 5, Episode 26, Time's Arrow, Part 1. The blurb is, the Enterprise is called upon by scientists to return to Earth, where there is evidence that aliens had visited the planet in the late 1800s. And Part 2, Captain Picard and the crew follow Data back to the 1800s to get him back, only to find the suspected alien visitors killing people of that time period. So, yeah, it's not about San Francisco until the second episode, which I had not remembered it that way. I thought they spent most of the time in San Francisco. So you had said that you weren't a super fan of this episode, but I am. I thought it was great. I thought it looked great. It felt like one of the movies. In fact, it would have made a great movie, like one of the next gen movies, if you think about it. But even the shots, the way they photographed the whole episode, even the makeup looked really good. It still felt kind of chintzy with the sets. It felt very, kind of typical.
A little TV production.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Like backlot type of stuff. But it looked good. I mean, the one thing that always pops out in the movies versus the television show is Data's makeup. Data's makeup always was kind of good enough for TV. And then you would see him in the movies like, oh, that looks amazing. You can see texture on his face. Yeah. And the contacts look better. The hair looks better. That's how it looked in this to me. Yeah. And I just felt like maybe it's because it was a huge deal. It was a 2-parter season closer that they spent more money on it.
Well, I mean, so I guess let me rephrase. Like, I thought this was a great episode. It was just, it felt almost like they had... They put in Mark Twain to have Mark Twain in the episode, and they weren't sure if they wanted him to be the antagonist or the sidekick. And so he was kind of both and neither at the same time. And he just the persona of Mark Twain in this episode was far more grating and pervasive than I would have liked, and than I liked. Like I didn't like him as a character.
I'm totally with you. I felt like that kind of outgoing, gregarious, overspoken caricature that he was playing would have been great as that opener where we see him making a speech to people. And that's where we get introduced to Guinan at that point. But I would have liked it if his one-on-one kind of persona was a little bit more depressed. Not depressed as in sad, but just not as flamboyant as they made this character. But he was flamboyant the entire episode. He was effectively yelling on the bridge of the episode. It's like, ran, 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 ran. It's like
Mr. Data, I sadly misjudged you.
Yeah, and it just felt nobody talks like that all the time.
Well, Skeletor does.
That's true. I stand corrected.
As I was doing that voice, I was like, oh, this sounds like Skeletor.
But yeah, I totally agree. He is sort of the weak link. I think if you were to delete him from the episode, nothing would be different.
Well, except they wouldn't be able to get back to the past. They would have left someone behind.
Well, you figure it out, right? You write it, you send in a red shirt. You have to make a sacrifice.
Don't tell him.
Oh, yeah, you don't tell him. Yeah. You send in Picard first, and don't worry, we'll be right. You can come in right afterward. Just step back a little bit, and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I felt like you could write it in a way very easily without that being a problem.
That would have been kind of fun if, like, Tom Riker was still on the ship, and that's who they sent back.
He's just been in his quarters somewhere playing trombone. No, you cut to him and he's reshaping his goatee. Doesn't he have a goatee?
By DS9 he does, yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of DS9, this episode actually became a 2-parter. So through the series, they wanted to strand Data somewhere, but they couldn't figure out a storyline to leave Data on a planet for an extended period of time that explained why the Enterprise would not be able to go get him. And so finally somebody suggested time travel, and they thought that was great. And And they decided for it to be a two-parter because there were rumors abounding that TNG was being canceled because DS9 was getting started. And so they specifically did a two-parter to show, like, no, we're still solid. Like, we've got extra seasons coming up. We can do a cliffhanger because we know that we're coming back. But what's funny about...
Oh, yeah, talk to Lois and Clark about that.
But did they know? Like,
Doesn't
I thought
always
they did.
work.
But we're not talking about Smallville.
Anyway, so to go back, I felt like this has all the type of science fiction that makes me love Next Gen.
Yes.
It's the type of science fiction where, like, for example, when they find the head of Data and they take it back to the ship, and Data says, what you guys need to chill out about this. Like, this, there's no fixing this. It will happen. It has happened. It's going to happen, right? This is evidence. It's like a little bit of determinism, which is a very science fiction-y kind of thing. And that was a wonderful moment. And I was like, this is a science fiction episode. This is a real Star Trek episode. Because even so, when they go into the whole exposition where Geordi is telling them how they can sort of recreate what Data did, et cetera, like there's a couple of scenes like that sort of front loaded into this episode. And it's perfect. It's a perfect example of technobabble because, whoops, my thing turned off. It's not just noise in the background like Voyager was prone to do. It wasn't just, okay, let's write a bunch of technobabble so we can get from point A to point B. And it doesn't necessarily make sense because it's too abstract and too unfamiliar.
Right. We can just do this magical thing that we've never done before. And here's the technobabble to somewhat explain it.
Exactly. But it's sophisticated enough to be intriguing and plausible. So you're thinking like, I don't know what any of these words mean, but the way they're stringing them together in terms of what does what and how it's going to help them, it's plausible. You can follow along.
Right.
And that's part of the genius of Next Gen is that they were able to walk that line of magic and science fiction plausibility. And it was great. It was great to listen to.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And what's interesting is behind the scenes, the writers actually were very frustrated with the part one because they did feel that there was too much technobabble that wasn't justifiably explained. And so that's why in the second episode, it's much more about the mystery of the aliens because that's just a mystery that needs to be solved. It's not they're not using technobabble to solve it.
Right. And frankly, that was a very magical villain, I guess you could call them. They were sort of, it felt very Harry Potter-esque or something like that, but they were still able to, they were still able to explain it though. It was sort of this magical thing that was happening, this fantastical thing inside of a science fiction episode. And even with that, I would normally not like that, but even with the fact that it was couched in all of this nice science fiction, I was totally fine with it.
Right. Well, and that was one of the things that the writers felt wasn't explained properly. It was just they're eating their neural activity, and it was kind of like, oh, okay. And then the aliens, they're like, we're doing this anyway, and Picard says, well, it's we're gonna have to stop you, and they're like, well, that'll just destroy your entire world. Bye.
Right. Which they didn't really look into that. She could have just lied about that, and Picard bought it and sent the message into the future, and they just bought it. So so there was no investigation. And I feel like that was another weak point, was that they didn't really explain. I got the sense that these people who were feeding these other people with everybody's neural energy or whatever, that they were not doing it freely, that they were sort of slaves to it. I have no way of backing that up with any specific thing, but the way that they were acting, it felt like there was an urgency to it, that it wasn't just a course of action. And I wanted to know more about that, but we never get that.
Right. You kind of got that impression based on the imagery, like the fact that they were all just standing around absorbing these globes, these glowing spheres. Like it gives a sense of they are a slave to it. They like, unless we're looking at a cafeteria in silhouette, so we can't see that it's different individuals, and it just looks like the same people are in there just eating all the time. No, all right. And
well, I thought like you were making an analogy of some kind, and I was waiting for the B plot of the analogy. And
think like if you didn't know what was going on, and you saw kind of a cafeteria in silhouette, so you couldn't make out the different individuals, It would just
Right.
look like people are in there, just sitting around eating, and that's all they do. And so,
Right. It's like, what is this life form's purpose? Just to
Yeah.
sit here and eat? Yeah, exactly. I see what you're saying. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
exactly right. It felt like it was very undeveloped.
right.
And it felt like to use your analogy, they never cast light on the silhouetted people. Like we never got any information about it.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that was one of the writers' frustrations, just about like the aliens weren't really overly developed. They liked the story on the Enterprise side of things, but the alien side was grossly underdeveloped. One of the other things that was really interesting is, and it's, for me, it is absolutely fascinating, and it's got to be like the quality of the writers' room, because they wrote this two-parter in the same way that Lost wrote the season 1 cliffhanger. They finished the first part, and they were like, "That's great! All right, guys, we'll see you in 2 months when we write episode 2."
Really?
Yeah.
That can't be. That can't be. I refuse to believe it. You've invoked Lost.
They,
And I don't know how I feel about that. You know how I
Right.
feel about Lost.
But no, like I think it just speaks to the quality of the writers' room. The fact that they spent about 6 weeks writing this episode, and they were just so there were complete plot lines that they threw out because they were backing themselves into corners that they didn't want to go into, and they wanted to make sure that they tied up all of the time stitches that were left dangling. And what's really cool about this is there's 2 separate episodes where Guinan talks about her past, and she says how like she's always had a thing for bald men, and how she was saved by an older gentleman when she was younger, and this episode is what she was referencing to.
But can we talk about this real quick? This whole Guinan Picard thing, because okay,
I
so
love
their
it. I absolutely love
their relationship on the ship, the contemporary relationship between Picard and Guinan,
Yeah.
is very much one where Picard goes to Guinan for guidance, for counsel about things. And that's the kind of relationship that they have. Like, I think Picard is shown to respect her very much. And there is no sexual energy until this episode where he meets her in the past, and you could have put in like a very dirty, sleazy saxophone solo over when he first sees her when she's young.
Right.
And you would have believed, you could show this scene, this sort of orphaned scene, to somebody, to anybody, and they'd be like, "Oh, they're obviously lovers in the future." You know,
Right.
Have you ever heard of The Time Traveler's Wife?
Yes.
So
We talked about it here.
that could be a scene lifted out of that book, where one of them knows the lovers, and they have this strong attraction. They don't know why. One of them doesn't know who the other person is, and that's what it felt like, without question. It was so
Right.
played like that. Why was it played like that? It made me uncomfortable.
The scene was played out in that way, but I feel like their conversation, like Picard just has such implicit trust with her, and I feel like they've always had this kind of care for each other, like not just affection, but genuine like wanting to ensure that the other person is doing well type of care. And so like when he said, it goes far beyond friendship. I think like that's how I inferred it. Obviously, it could be inferred the other way, because it goes far beyond friendship kind of strongly implies that. But
Right.
he's like, we've been banging for centuries.
Well, and that I mean, if we got to the end of this show, the next gen show, and it was like, it turns out they have been banging, I wouldn't be surprised. It makes sense. But I don't know. I felt like it was a betrayal. Picard's performance, it was a betrayal of their relationship in a way. Because he played it like he was horny.
Right.
And it's like, oh, you get to and she, even though she's 500 years younger, she doesn't look any younger, I guess.
Right. Well, and that was the thing. It was like he was seeing her as a younger woman, but she doesn't look any younger. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, you're so much hotter when you're half a millennia younger.
Yeah. So when Data shows up to that party that Guinan is at, and he's like, I must speak to Guinan, excuse me. And she realizes what's going on with him, and he doesn't realize what's going on, that we get a little bit of Whoopi, a little bit, when she kind of is like, nah, this is
Mr. Data.
Yeah,
Right.
We got a little bit of Whoopi. It was kind of nice to see like a little bit of, I don't know, maybe you could attribute that to her being younger and just having a little bit more energy for that type of thing.
Yeah.
I liked it. I thought it was great.
Well, and then going back to the Riker scene with Guinan, I didn't like that. She should have had some little button on her conversation with Riker. Like, she should have had the last word instead of just sitting there silent when he's like, you have to tell me what to do, and she just doesn't say anything.
Although she did already answer that question. So you'd have to have him ask another question that was an escalation of some kind, because the reason she doesn't answer is because he asked the question again and she had already answered it, and so that I can see Guinan doing that. So I kind of agreed. So the first time we see Guinan in this episode, they have that push in on her when she realizes what's happening. She's like, full circle, and she's like, huh. I was like, we don't need that. Unnecessary. We can just have the push in with a concerned look on her face, and we're like, oh, intrigue. What's going to happen? Usually Guinan is kind of okay with everything, with a few exceptions. And so when she's not okay with it, then we know that something is something
like
is
in yesterday's Enterprise. Yeah. And it would have been nice if she had said a line to no one that Picard said to her. Like, what she said in the first episode is what Picard said to her at the end of the second episode.
Right.
She doesn't have to tie it back again where she's talking with Riker saying, it's a full circle. Even Picard knew that.
Yeah, I felt like they were a little bit hand-holdy with the audience, the writers were. I think that I can understand why. They were asking the audience, they were asking a lot of the audience.
It's a pretty dense episode, yeah. I don't know if you noticed or not, but the poker player, did you see who that was?
Yes, I did. I didn't know the name, so I didn't write it down, the Cardassian thing that he plays. And I was too lazy to go look it up, but I did notice that. And I actually looked up, and this was before DS9.
Right.
Wasn't it? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, this was the last role that he played on TNG. So I think he's got two other ones. But so far we've seen him as the Romulan in the first season episode, where the Romulans are back. And
never comes back, by the way.
Right. Yep.
Are they back? Or are they leaving?
And then this episode where he's just kind of a bit player on TNG, but he was so good that they said, hey, we've got this Cardassian character. Do you want to do it? I
mean, he's a great actor. I was really glad that he was not the villain of the episode. That they could have totally played it where now this shady poker playing, backroom
has
guy.
A vendetta. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. And I felt like, oh God, I don't want to watch this episode again.
Right. Yeah. So something about Mark Twain, which I found really interesting. So I don't know if you know this or not, but the guy who played Mark Twain actually had a one-man show as Mark Twain.
Oh, that's interesting. I guess who better to get for a role like this than somebody like that?
Right. And so the story goes that he was playing Mark Twain as a one-man show, and they said, do you want to be this, do you want to be on TNG?
Can you do Abraham Lincoln? We need somebody for Abraham Lincoln.
Well, but it's actually the opposite. So he was supposed to play Mark Twain for this episode, and he was kind of reading the character and the person and all that kind of thing, like all the biographies, and he got so engrossed into who Mark Twain was, who Samuel Clemens was, that he then created the one-man show and started touring with that.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
I would love to see a recording of that, just to see how it plays against his character in this.
I know, because it's so... You're just completely... Like, every time I think about it, he's just so bombastic through the whole thing.
Yeah. Just didn't feel like, this is not a real person. It felt like somebody in makeup playing who they thought Mark Twain was, having only read a book about them or something like that.
Yeah. Well, and just the 180 on his character, like the fact that he was determined to stop them at all costs, and he was still determined on the Enterprise, and then finally just Troy's talking to him. Like, he says, like, and those are the lies you feed these aliens. And she's like, no, they work here genuinely, and we've eliminated all these things. And he's like, well, you must be telling the truth now. Like, it
right.
It was too fast, and there wasn't anything that really solidified him now believing her.
Yeah, I mean, I remember looking at the when I was watching the second episode, looking at the timer at the bottom, like the progress bar, and at 5 minutes there was still no resolution in sight.
Right.
So I was like, wait a minute, is something wrong with Netflix?
Yeah, and the ending just tied it up.
They just wrapped it up super fast. And yeah, so I don't know. I think that it felt like maybe they were having a writing problem because the aliens are so underdeveloped and because Mark Twain was so one-dimensional. All the data stuff was great. I had an idea though.
Okay.
Let me give you an idea. So what if Twain, I actually was expecting this. I was expecting him to have stolen something from the Enterprise because that just seems to be, he seems to be very mischievous that way.
Yeah. Well, yeah, he stole the piece from, the time shift thing. Yeah.
Right. And so I was expecting him to have like a tricorder or just something from the future that was very technologically advanced. And how great would it have been if that was the case? The last shot is him pulling out the phaser and looking at it and sort of smiling mischievously. And the next episode, so this was the season opener, right? We don't even go back to the Enterprise, which I think is what happens anyway. We don't go back to the Enterprise. The next episode 2 of season 6, is like a Yesterday's Enterprise type of environment where Picard is the only one who, for some reason, cannot see that everything is different. And because he changed the future in some way that made everybody evil or something like that. I don't know at that point, if that's the fulcrum point, the turning point of where history would have diverged. Yeah.
Right.
What would have been different? It would have been fun to, not in a Yesterday's Enterprise where that seems very self-contained, but make it much more pervasive in terms of the effects of putting something like that in the past where like he did something, it brought aliens too late or too early and etc. Then you could have had a 2-parter, 4-parter, even half the season where Picard is trying to fix it. And he, of course, has to get Data, right, to help him. And maybe Data doesn't exist, or he has to go to another planet and get Data because whoever, Nunyan Soong, was either behind or didn't know. So he helps him and to make Data realize. So, you know what I mean? Like, that would have been really interesting as a consequence of Mark Twain being mischievous.
Right.
I would watch that.
No, and that's, I mean, we've talked about this a couple times now. Like, that is the kind of Star Trek that I want to see, where there is a story arc through at least half the season, if not the full season, and each episode is self-contained, where there is a problem that's presented at the start of the episode and resolved by the end of the episode, but also there's a B plot or even a C plot where there is more information provided for the overall conflict or mystery.
Right, which is kind of Picard, I guess.
Yeah, but there's not self-contained in the episodes. Like, you get more information in the episodes, but there's not a conflict that's presented at the start of the episode that's resolved at the end. I'm
not sure that you could make a satisfying episode where you have both. I think that I think it has to be totally serialized, where they're going on an adventure and it's like just a giant 8-hour movie where there might be some sort of catharsis at the end of it, which there are. It's not like they just are in mid-sentence and the episode stops next week on Picard. So there are stopping points, but it isn't in this thing where everything is going to be fine and we start over at the beginning of the next episode. So I think that there's only so far. I would rather it leaned into the serialization rather than trying to balance the two. No,
I think Enterprise did it, and I think the original idea of Voyager would have done it as well. Where each episode is its own thing, but the overall mission is to get back home.
And Voyager probably did that the best, I guess. Maybe Enterprise was pretty good at it in terms of it being a mid-90s television show, or I guess Enterprise was not mid-90s, but you know what I mean.
Well, going after the Xindi is what I'm thinking of. Like we've seen 2 or 3 episodes of that where the episode does have a conflict that starts at the beginning and does end at the end, but they're still trying to find the Xindi the Deathticles.
For the one person who's able to get that reference, bravo.
You're old is what we're trying to say.
So there's a point where Picard holds back Data in a conversation they're having where Data says, you can't now isolate me from life just because you know that I died, because it could happen decades, centuries from now.
Those were such great scenes. All the dialogue that had to do with him dying. Like I loved how everyone was trying to protect him. He was fine with it, and then it became an inevitability. He had to go down to the planet. I loved all of that. Okay, go ahead.
Right. Yeah. I agree. And so Data says...
That was my point, Nick.
And so Data says you can't cheat fate. Or you cannot cheat fate. And Picard says something like, perhaps we can't, Mr. Data. And so the second half of that sentence, I'm like, oh, we're going to get a great Picardism. He's going to say something that's like heartwarming.
Right.
And that makes sense, kind of in a what I've learned from Guinan kind of wisdom type of thing. And he says, perhaps we can't, Mr. Data, but perhaps we could give it a try. Yep. I'm like, do you want another shot at that? Yeah, that's exactly how I felt. I'm like, oh, that's very unsatisfying.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was that's another, I guess, slight weak link of like, here's why we need to do that. Here's why I must do this. I must protect my family. This is how we humans are. If you want to be more like humans, this is what we do. We do illogical things. So get back on the bridge and seatbelt yourself in because you're not going anywhere.
Right. Actually, and then just the following scene, just you talking about the cinematography. I haven't seen this shot before, and it was so cool. Where it's on Picard, and then the camera lowers to underneath the console that Worf stands at, and it's got the opening, and it's frames Data, and he turns around and and he says like I am the answer or something like that. They
had a couple of fun shots where they have the dead head of Data, and then behind it, Data actually pops his head up, when they're studying it. They had a couple of like clever things that they did with the cinematography. I thought they did a great job.
Yeah.
But so I want to go back to another Data thing, or rather another Riker thing. No, it's a Data thing, but it includes Riker, as most of the show does. So there's a little bit of an incongruity with Data's quest to become more human. Mm-hmm. And so he's talking to Geordi about the end of his life, and he says, well, this is kind of helpful and almost a bit comforting that there is an end in sight for me, that before I was just sort of expecting to live indefinitely, and this gives me a finite existence. And this idea that, that helps me feel like I'm this much closer to being a human. And I go back to this episode where Q makes Riker a Q. And he, at the end of the episode, goes to Data and says, we know what's going to happen. And Data stops him. And he says, to thine own self be true. If you just made me a human, that would be unacceptable to me. And that's always sat funny with me, because if he's endeavoring to become human, that is the ultimate thing. And of course, once someone is human, that is not the end of endeavoring to be human. We all endeavor to be human in the sense of what does that mean, and what do we make of our lives type of thing. So it's not like his quest would be over. It would just be accelerated quite a bit.
Right.
So why not take it in that instance, where Riker has offered him humanship?
Well, because it's a difference between striving for it and earning it on your own and being given it. It's kind of the same thing about him knowing that he's going to die. Like, the comfort there is he knows he's going to die in the same way that all humans know we're going to die, but we don't know when. And so it's kind of the same thing for him. Like, it could be tomorrow, it could be 10 years from now, it could be centuries from now, like he said. But the fact that he does have an endpoint, which immediately got taken away by the second episode, proves to him that he is mortal in the same way that all humans are. So for Riker to just give him what he's trying to earn on his own, it rings hollow. It's not the same.
I suppose, but he would have never achieved what Riker was offering to him, at least in as pure of a way, because I'm assuming that he would just become a human and that would be it.
Right.
So why not be accelerated into that? Sort of in the sense of, if someone could magically grant me perfect pitch, to reference a Patreon discussion that we had. Actually, no, that was a Patreon preview. So everybody should know the discussion that we had. Anyway, if someone were to grant me perfect
really
pitch.
Glad you cleared that up.
Yeah. I forgot. Okay. I would take it, not because, it is something I could never achieve.
Exactly.
So I would take that without question. So it's sort of the same thing. It's always not like, I've never really understood why he wouldn't. I mean, maybe he regrets it every day of his life, but I don't know. That decision, we know why they made it, because then you just have another human named Data, and that wouldn't have been exciting.
Well, but I feel like it's also it's more akin to someone magically falling in love with you, that you want them to love. Like, kind of what you said about immediately regretting it. Like, yes, you might ask for it initially, but then the entire time you would know that it wasn't genuine. Like, they were doing it because somebody forced them to. And so, I feel like it would be kind of the same thing with Data just being given the opportunity to to be human. No, not being given the opportunity. Like it's being forced upon him.
He didn't make him human. Be like, do you like that data? He's like, no, make me.
Right.
What should ask me?
But I mean, so yeah, but I feel like that's why he's turning it down, and I feel like that's why Riker asked. I don't think that Data wants it in a disingenuous manner like that.
Actually, I don't think Riker asks. I think Riker sort of walks towards him, and Data realizes what's going on and says, "No, thank you."
Right.
I think that's. I don't remember exactly how it goes. I remember it being a really fun moment. Not fun, but
poignant
moment. Yeah.
It would have been great if he got it and he's like, I don't want this. But before you take it away, I'm, he's, her, you're, there, we've, could have.
Right. That's not a consistent trait of Data anyway, right? Because he uses contractions sometimes.
I thought we already talked about this. So the only time that he used contractions and where they come up the most is before they provided his brother, and that's because it wasn't a character trait until his brother came along, and then Data was saying he can use contractions, I cannot.
So speaking of inconsistencies, so with Data, we're focusing on Data a lot, but
I can't imagine why.
Yeah, I know. Nobody likes Data.
And it's not like he was a big part in the episode.
So Data, I didn't like that they were inconsistent in playing him as sort of an inept android who doesn't understand humans, and so, beep, boop, bop, boop, versus him being very shrewd and calculated, especially in this episode. Like, there were times where he lifts up the anvil with one hand after Jack London was having trouble carrying it up the stairs, and he's like, ow. And I was like, okay, we get it. A little android humor for everybody. But then he's sort of able to navigate all these other things where he is actually calculating certain things, and he is being actually very smart. I'm trying to think of an example. I can't think of an example, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, and yes, that's the funny Data moment, or the funny android moment. But I felt like also it was kind of a focus versus it was more of a focus thing. He received the anvil. It was time to move forward with the next step, and then he kind of realized that Jack London was still there, and so
it's meant as being, I didn't think of this. I'm used to, but I don't know. He's an android. He's doing trillions, if not quadrillions, of calculations per second. And that wasn't one of them. I don't know. I understand it. I wish that there was less android humor at this point. We're in the last season, or the last episode of the 5th season. Do we really need a human joke? Ha 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 ha. Do we need that at this point from Data? We don't. We've done it. Oh, one of the best scenes of this whole episode, by the way, and actually of the first episode. I liked the first episode, or I should say part 1 more than part 2, but it was an amazing scene on all fronts where Data unphases himself, and he's relating over the comms what he sees and what's going on. Mm-hmm. And it's played silently by the rest of the crew because they cannot talk back to him. And how Brent Spiner delivers all of that dialogue, which is kind of dry if you were to see it written on a page, but he delivers it very evocatively. And everybody's face and the music is building, and the way they shot everything, where, it's very difficult to shoot something where it's essentially voiceover and keep it interesting. And they were able to keep it interesting because you're just sort of watching, I guess, not the terror, but the utter concern for what's going to happen. Because they all know that Data's going to die, and they know this is an episodic television show, so they're pretty sure it's going to happen within the confines of this episode. And so it was just well done. It was an amazing little bit of, this is how you do this. This is how you create tension with just dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. What's interesting is they ended the episode with them going back in time, right? Like that was how the first part ended. Is that right?
I think so. I think they all step into it, and then into the glowing void, and
and that was kind of the cliffhanger. Like I would have had the cliffhanger be Data's head. I
mean, that was the cold open. I think you needed that in the cold open. Otherwise...
Right, yeah. But I'm saying, like, bookend the episode with Data's head. Like, that's the cold open of, oh my gosh, like, that's the conflict they have to resolve.
Right, yeah.
And then end it, not only as a reminder, but as kind of like a, now Data's dead, what's going to happen next?
Yeah, I mean, I also thought you could have ended the cold open with Guinan. So you start the episode in San Francisco in the late 1800s, and Data shows up and says, and you hear a kerfuffle in the back, and you see that Data shows up, and you have that whole discussion between them, and that's the cold open. And that would have been interesting too. Like, that's the fun thing about time, is that, or time travel kind of episodes, is that you can splice up all these different moments, and you can say like, oh, that would have been a great episode right there. Just that moment. And so I agree with you. There's so many. This episode is full of that stuff.
Just little things that just could have been plussed up, but it wasn't bad in and of itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What would have been funny about that though is somebody from the future talking to somebody in the past, relating their story. So it's a flashback of the future that happened in the past.
Trying to think of how that would work.
Well, him trying to explain to her, why he's there and where he came from. Like, we would then have to watch the episode, and so all of that would be happening in his past, but in the timeline future. That's
true. I don't know. It would have been it's one of those cold opens that maybe wouldn't live up, or the episode wouldn't live up to the cold open, because it's just such an interesting thing where you have Guinan obviously in the past, not in the holodeck. You have to establish that somehow. I don't know how you do that, but and then she's talking to people. She's talking to Mark Twain, and then Data shows up. I'm from the future.
Yeah. No, you're right. Like, you couldn't do that as a cold open, because there's no way Data could accurately convey that it's not the holodeck.
No, well, that's the problem with the holodeck, is every episode could be taking place in the holodeck, and you'd never know. There's no way around that unless you step out of the paradigm of the show and say, oh, and you see Riker controlling everything in the background or something. It just couldn't do it. So that is a problem.
Riker as a chef in the kitchen. Speaking of chef in the kitchen, so one of the things that they wanted to do with the episode was actually show that much more time had passed with them being stuck in the 1800s, trying to solve everything. And Picard was going to have his own bakery. And the joke would have been that just all of his food was just not very good.
I love that they have to spend weeks, months, years in the past, and they have their own lives there. I don't know why they wouldn't be sort of getting to the matter at hand, which is making sure these people don't die. I mean, that would have been interesting. It's only interesting though in retrospect, in the sense that I wouldn't want to see them carry this out. Like, I'm glad that we jumped in, after that had taken place.
Right. Well, yeah, and it just there was so much going on in the episode that they couldn't fit that in as well.
And the idea of a 4-parter, 3-parter just doesn't sound right. It should be a 4-parter, right?
Why?
Like, I don't know, it just sounds better to me. But I guess that would not have been feasible, or even they would not have conceived of something like that, where it's 4 parts or 3 parts where there's ongoing stuff. That doesn't really happen, does it? Does it happen?
Not on Star Trek, no.
Or and on anything? I mean, do they have, where it is truly episodic, where they have 3-parter episodes?
I don't know.
I don't think that's ever happened.
What do you think, listeners? If you know of one, tell it to us.
Yeah, but I think, aside from Samuel Clemens, so were we to believe that he was old in this episode? So I thought that he was already Mark Twain at this point. And he was famous because the writer kept bugging him for a story, as though he was someone who a story would be interesting about. I don't know.
Well, yeah, they kept going back and forth between Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens. So he was known for that. It's just he was correcting people that wasn't his name.
Okay. Well, then why did he write under it then?
I think when he first started off, he didn't want to, he didn't want his name attached to it if it wasn't good. That would be my guess. Or maybe he was in a position where he wasn't allowed to be writing, and so he had to pick a nom de plume. I don't know.
And we'll never know.
Yep. No way of finding out.
So I'm definitely going to say a proper Star Trek episode, without a doubt. There's no way around it. Both of them. I think we should look at them as a unit, and I think.
So what's the ethical or moral dilemma?
That's a good point. I may have to ignore that part of the criteria for this one.
I mean, in the first one, obviously in the first part, the ethical or moral dilemma is, do you send your friend to their death?
Well, they didn't know that. They didn't know they were sending their friend to their death, but they knew they were putting him in peril. To me, the more of the moral argument is, do you now isolate your friend from life because you have been given a glimpse as to what their fate is? And even as illogical as it was, they were still doing that, and they were confronted with that by data. And that was more of the argument to me, was that, okay, so now do we continue living our life, or do we, which is a common theme in this show, that they encounter this a lot, where that's actually the discussion that Guinan and Riker have. Is like, Riker says to Guinan as a retort, what if you not saying anything is the wrong move to me? What if you not giving me information is the wrong move? So the idea of do we or don't we, in terms of the safety of not knowing the future, I think that was more of the moral problem.
On the second part. Yeah. Okay, there you go. And that's what makes it a good Star Trek episode. That's what makes it a proper Star Trek episode. And then just the quality of the writer's room is what makes it a good Star Trek episode.
Well, I mean, it would be good nonetheless, regardless.
It makes it a good episode. Yeah.
Yes. So there is one part, another kind of me bashing Samuel Clemens here. So at the part where there's a part where Samuel Clemens is rushing into one of his cabs, and he says to the reporter guy, "When is your deadline?" And he says 5 o'clock, and he says, "I will see you back at your paper at 4:30 with the story of your life." I don't know why he's Janeway all of a sudden, but
he's Skeletor.
And I'm thinking to myself, okay, the writer Samuel Clemens thinks you can write a newspaper article in half an hour, like after being given the information. So he has maybe 15 minutes to write the story of his life newspaper article.
To type it up, get it into the reverse print that is then slammed into the newspaper printing press. Yeah.
Yeah, that was...
I will see you at 4:30 for the newspaper tomorrow.
Yeah, not great writing I guess, if we're...
Especially from a writer.
Yeah.
Like, a writer wrote that.
Yeah. About a writer.
Right.
Oh, okay. So there's a science fiction thing that happens, or rather a time travel thing that happens here. The whole point of these aliens going back to the time, this 1890s or whenever they go back to,
right?
Is
that pandemic plague? Yeah,
right. There's a pandemic plague, but the whole point here is that you don't have. It's not as much trouble to kidnap these people and kill them. So just go back, to like the year -5000 BC. Where people are way more pliable back then, and you don't have to dress up or anything. You just show up, take what you need, and leave.
Yeah.
Why do you need to go to the 1890s where you have to dress up and have to deal with the inconveniences of that?
Right. I did think about that. Yeah. Well, I mean, so the one thought that I had just hearing you say it out loud is that it could be there's a little bit more of. This is right before the Industrial Revolution, so it could be that they needed brains that had the capacity of like growth and discovery and curiosity and that kind of thing. Obviously, the people they're taking are ones that are on death's door, so it's not necessarily that they need the people who are doing that kind of thinking, but they need the brain to have that capacity, And going back to like 5000 BC, the brains at that time were just not as developed, in theory.
Right. I suppose, they could have come up with an answer somewhere along the lines, Earth at this particular moment was closest to them, galaxy-wise, right. And so that's why they chose that time and that period and et cetera. I guess you could have some sort of science fiction answer. They just didn't have one. It was just, somebody was shooting a movie about San Francisco in the 1890s, and we could use the set, so that's why they're going back to that time.
Yeah. The 90s was actually considered as well, but like Star Trek 4, I think. The Voyage Home. They'd just done it, so they decided against that.
It was fun to see them all dressed up. Actually, Beverly Crusher looked really cool as an 1890s nurse. Right. The way they did her hair and the glasses and the outfit, it's just cool. It just looked neat.
Yeah. And it was... I love that they didn't draw any attention to it because it was such a wide shot, but I love how subtle she was about hiding the tricorder under her apron. I don't know if you saw that or not.
Yes, and the same thing with Geordi's visor. For example, there was a point where the doctor had just left the operating room or whatever, and they're slowly panning over, and you see Geordi closing putting glasses back into his jacket. Like he already had the visor on. So that was to suggest, that he did that off screen, kind of like the same thing where you hear a beaming sound, but you don't see the beaming. Like they wanted to just handle that, I guess. But I liked it. It was a really thoughtful execution of the script.
Well, and LaForge in the 19th century was great, being legitimately blind. Because like the other scene with the cane,
Yes.
where they snatched it out of his hand and there's no reaction until it's gone. And then he has a bit of like a panic of like, thought maybe he dropped it or, got yanked out of his hand unexpectedly, and he kind of reaches out and then just brings his hand back, like realizing that somebody else took it from him.
It was cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
They didn't say like, oh, is this man blind? Yes, he is. He was blinded in a horse racing accident.
Right. Yeah. Like he's just blind.
Yeah. Or they didn't have to talk about it. They did it visually, which is, I appreciate it.
Yeah, so we didn't talk about that at all. LeVar Burton was so good in these 2 episodes, because the other part of it too was his technobabble. Like, he's the smartest person in the room when it comes to engineering and when it comes to data, and he's still trying to figure things out. And his technobabble, he's looking at stuff and he's going, "No, this should work." And then he's talking with the computer, and he didn't get it on the first try. He put everything back the way it was supposed to be, and it wasn't working. And so he had to go back in and fiddle around to try and figure out why it wasn't working. And I feel like that's something that that TNG just knocked out of the park as far as technobabble and as far as like just LeVar Burton acting all of the dialogue, that Voyager just totally missed the mark.
Yeah, he internalized it. By the way, I need to correct you that LeVar Ferge. I can't even intuitively know where that came from. That Geordi LaForge is the smartest person in the room when it comes to engineering, with the caveat if Janeway is in the room. Then he is no longer the smartest person in the room.
Well, right, but the moment Janeway comes into the room, you are no longer the smartest person, even if you were the smartest person.
Well, no one is the smartest. She is the smartest person in the room at any given point.
Yeah.
In any room.
Yeah.
No.
All right, so let's see what we're watching next.
Okay.
Voyager! Season 5, Episode 9, 30 Days. And the blurb says, in a letter to his father, Tom Paris tells the story of the events leading up to his demotion to ensign and his sentence to 30 days in Voyager's brig.
Well, that's kind of fun. It's just another flashback, sort of a story told through flashback, where you could have just started the show at the beginning of the flashback, leading up to the thing. I don't know. It's sort of like the other Neelix episode we watched, where it was called, I can't remember the name of it, where he's telling the story to the kids as a bedtime story.
Oh, the Ghost of Deck 13.
Yeah, we're doing that again, apparently, is my guess.
Right.
I don't remember this episode, but I have a feeling that's what we're doing.
I think, a voiceover flashback. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, boy.
I write a letter to my... Yep. Super excited about that. I love episodes where there's no tension, because we're hearing from the person who has all the drama happening to them.
Well, they already know what's going to happen, and so there's not a sense of. I mean, you can do this right. You can do this sort of.
You can absolutely.
It can be fun to do. It's just they don't usually do it fun.
Right.
But let's give it a chance.
Yeah, let's see if we're wrong. Let's go watch it.